I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the House of Learning Lectures. We welcome students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests here today to hear Dr. David Whittaker, curator of 19th century Western Americana and Mormon manuscripts in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections Division of the Harold B. Lee Library, deliver today's House of Learning lecture entitled My Dear Friend, The Letters Between Brigham Young and Thomas L. Kane. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together students and scholars to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lecture Series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now, about today's speaker. Dr. David Whittaker is curator of 19th century Western Americana and Mormon manuscripts and is one of the foremost scholars on 19th century Mormonism. Dr. Whittaker received his baccalaureate degree from BYU in 1967 and an MA in 1973 from California State University at Northridge. He returned to BYU to work on a doctorate in history and received his PhD in 1982. He is the author of numerous articles on the history of Mormonism and is the curator who has created registers for the papers of several important and prominent figures in early LDS history, including Parley P. Pratt, Joseph Smith, and Brigham Young, among many others. His interests in the American West naturally flow to Brigham Young and the migration to the Great Basin, and much of Dr. Whittaker's work deals with the settlement of the Utah Territory, for which Thomas L. Kane was most instrumental. A prolific scholar, should one search the BYU catalog for Dr. Whittaker's articles, books, and registers, they would find over 150 titles. Of the many scholars at BYU, the library's Dr. Whittaker is a world authority on early Mormonism, and therefore it gives great pleasure today to welcome our House of Learning lecturer, my colleague and friend, Dr. David Whittaker.
I'm truly grateful to be able to spend some time with you today. We're kicking off today what we hope will be a full school year's celebration of the life and times of Thomas Kane. We have been gathering into the BYU library for a long time. I've been curator here for some 25 years. We've worked hard to gather materials related to the Kane family and have, I think, now established probably the world's best collection of papers relating to Thomas and his wife, Elizabeth. We owe a lot of thanks to those who we've worked with over the years, both the library administration, the university administration, and even the Board of Trustees, who on a few occasions have been brought in to discuss and and approve the acquiring of major collections. I can't forget my wife, who probably thinks we've had an extra person living in the house for many years, and I'm sure she still thinks Tom Elizabeth's ghosts wander through our hallways and study occasionally, so I appreciate her patience. Today we focus on Thomas Kane's relationship with Brigham Young, but I don't want to leave you with the impression, especially those who are new to this topic, that that's all we have. We have an incredibly rich and deep collection relating to Thomas Kane and his family. Kane, of course, was a descendant from a powerful Philadelphia family. He married his second cousin and a woman of great talent. The BYU collections dealing with the Kanes extend not just their Mormon connections, but Elizabeth's rich diaries and papers and scrapbooks, Tom's Civil War papers. He fought a number of places, including Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg. He was involved in the development of some of the areas in the northwest corner of Pennsylvania. He was involved in anti-slavery and worked with the Underground Railroad. He worked in a number of things that we'll talk about a little bit later. And so the collection is not just about the Mormon connections. It's also a rich repository of Americana, particularly 19th century American history. So we will be talking mostly here and in the exhibit on his life and times that will open next month in our Special Collections exhibit area. We'll focus primarily on his relationship with the Latter-day Saints, but we shouldn't forget that he had a rich life, an important life far beyond just the Mormon relationships, although I will argue that was the major thread that ran through his life. We will be having, in connected with our exhibit, a series of lectures, and we appreciate the BYU Studies, Jack Welch and his people for helping co-sponsor these series. You've probably received a card when you came in. On the back is the whole series that we've established and arranged for major scholars to come and further probe different areas of Tom and Elizabeth's life. We invite you to those from now through the end of the exhibit period. Some of those scholars are here today. We appreciate their willingness to be a part of that. Living as we do in an age of electronic telecommunications with instant text messaging and emails and portable telephones, I think it's difficult for most of us, particularly students today, to try to imaginatively enter into a world of only the written and spoken word, a world of personal relationships which required careful attention to the realities of distances of time and space for the creation of both public and private information. Much of what we're dedicated to preserving in special collections, of course, is, in fact, those kinds of records. During much of 19th century Mormonism's history, it could take weeks, if not months, for one letter to go from its creator to the addressee, if it got there at all, or if it got there without being read by people to whom it wasn't addressed. These create serious problems, and when you add to the unstable nature of the Mormon experience in the 19th century in terms of persecution, mass movements of populations, and the roughness of the western frontier, I think we can begin to see how precious the letters that have survived are for helping us further understand relationships of people separated by time and space. Such physical challenges, of course, are multiplied by the level of relationships, the state of the postal service in the area we're dealing with, as well as the costs, which often could be beyond an average person's ability to pay even the postage for. And unlike emailing today, which can, I think, easily trivialize the message being sent so quickly and easily, correspondence in earlier times was more focused and generally thus more thoughtful. Erasmus, I remember, defined a letter as a kind of mutual exchange of speech between absent friends. That's a nice definition. And before the invention of the telegraph and the telephone, and besides face-to-face communication, letter writing was the means of communication between people. And for those of us who wish to study the past, essential records, which must be probed. Of course, not all letters are of the same value, but how much poorer would we be if we didn't have, for example, the rich treasure trove of the letters of Thomas Jefferson and John and Jane Addams? By reading their letters, really thoughtful essays, I think, written between those who were present at the creation, so to speak, we are invited into the conversation of two great minds who were among the founding fathers of America. Their correspondence, as Thomas Jefferson wrote Adams, would constitute a journal of their lives, revealing their concerns, their friendships under stress, and of course, their great love for their life's work. A number of years ago, Dean Jesse gathered together letters that were exchanged between Brigham Young and his sons, and of course edited those for publication. These remain, I would argue, a wonderful record of Brigham Young's role as a father, a role that he considered the most important of all of his many responsibilities. These letters let us see a father who just happened to be prophet and president of the church, counseling his own sons about topics on missionary work, the books they were reading, their schooling, their friends, as well as their expressions of love and appreciation the sons shared with their earthly father. To read these letters is to be invited into a personal conversation that continues to teach us many years after they were written. I would suggest to you that the Brigham Young Thomas L. Kane letters provide another important source for understanding not just Brigham and Thomas, but major topics in early Mormon history. I suppose I should begin with the biographical sketches of both. I don't think we need to say much about Brigham Young to this audience. He was born in 1801 and died in 1877. He was a close associate of Joseph Smith, one of the first presidents of the Quorum of 12, and of course became the successor in church leadership to Joseph Smith upon Joseph's death in 1844, and then, of course, the key colonizer and leader of the church in its westward movement and development. Kane is less well known to a Mormon audience, unfortunately. He was born in January of 1822. He died in December of 1873. His father, and we'll only have time to talk about a few members of the Kane family, was a personal friend of Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk. It is said that John Kane was a speechwriter for Andrew Jackson. He was appointed eventually in the 1840s to the federal bench in Philadelphia. He was a major figure in Philadelphia society and obviously became the major connection to the Eastern political establishment that Tom was able to use so effectively for defending and explaining the cause of the Latter-day Saints. Thomas himself was frail. He lived in England and France from ages 17 to 22. He went there to recover his health in part, but also to maybe experience the grand tour that young aristocratic sons were encouraged to do. French thinkers obviously would have a major influence on his life, and we don't have time to develop that here, but that's certainly true. He returned to Philadelphia, where the family home was, in 1844, the year Joseph Smith was killed. He would study law with his father and would be eventually admitted to the bar in 1846. But he was never really attracted to the legal profession. Social and political issues would attract him throughout his life, however. It was the forced Mormon exodus from Nauvoo in 1846 that drew his attention to the cause of the Latter-day Saints. We all anxiously anticipate the publishing early next year by Yale University Press of Matthew Grove's important new biography on Thomas Kane. We've invited Matt to be our concluding speaker in this series, and we'll have those books available at that time. But it is really the first major biography of Kane since Zobel's biography in the 1940s. And so lots of new things are happening as new Kane documents are uncovered. Brigham Young and Thomas L. Kane first met in 1846. Brigham Young was 45, Thomas Kane was 22. Kane was single. Brigham Young had, of course, entered into plural marriage. It's estimated that he had at least 39 wives by February of 1846. Both men were short by the standards of the time, 5'6". Kane, however, was more fragile, probably not weighed more than 130 pounds his entire life, and was thinner and more frail than Young, although, while it's not well known, both men would struggle with health issues throughout their lives, one thing I think which drew them together in part. Brigham Young would die probably of a ruptured appendix. Thomas Kane from complications from pneumonia. The letters. There are about 125 extant letters exchanged between Brigham Young and Thomas Kane. They extend from 1846, when they first met, until Brigham Young's death in 1877. The letters averaged from 3 to 4 per year, with a few spikes. In 1857, during the Utah War, there were 22 letters exchanged between them. 1861, 11. In 1871, 9. The letters themselves vary in length, from one-page notes to 9-plus page detailed information. Kane could address his letters as much to the First Presidency as to Brigham Young, as he became acquainted with Willard Richards and others. But not all the letters are extant. There are references in the existing letters to other letters, and we know as Mormonism became a more critical issue in American politics and society that they began to use ciphers. We have a copy of one of the cipher books they use in the Kane papers here at BYU, and no doubt those were either destroyed or simply remain unavailable to this day. As time passed, of course, various individuals going east from Salt Lake were given oral instructions to deliver to Kane, which they did, and so not all the information in their relationship will be probably ever available in written form. Both men used scribes, Brigham Young more than Kane, and Brigham Young was more careful in keeping copies of the correspondence he sent, even keeping drafts of his letters. In addition, Kane received and sent letters to and from a lot of other LDS general authorities. We're not going to focus on that today, essentially, but the main locations of these letters we're talking about today are either the Brigham Young papers in the Church Archives in Salt Lake or the Tom and Elizabeth Kane extended collections here in the BYU Library, and I draw from both of those. There are, however, a few other repositories throughout the United States, and some even remain to this moment in private hands. Much of the Kane collection itself was organized and probably maintained and preserved by his wife Elizabeth. Plenty of evidence for that if you look at the collection. When she died, of course, the collection was passed down to descendants, and subsequently they have sort of disposed of them as they've seen fit. We've been fortunate to work with a number of members of the Kane family, a few are here today, to be able to gather those together like feathers to the wind almost, to gather them back and preserve them as a central repository to honor and help scholars study and more fully understand and relate to the rich Kane heritage. Thomas Kane's father's papers in the American Philosophical Society, his well-known brother Elijah Kent Kane, the Arctic explorer, those papers remain in private hands, some of which I've had the opportunity to look at, but they have not been made available to the public yet. Well, there's a couple of things we can do today. We have a pond before us. We can skip rocks across the surface, or we can throw a few big boulders in and get a splash and have it sink, and I'm going to try to do a little of both today. First, let's skip the rock across the pond and just mention some of the major themes that occur when you read these the rich correspondence between these two individuals. They obviously are going to discuss the major issues of the day, so you're going to find both Kane and Brigham Young's feelings expressed on polygamy, polygamy, we'll come to that, slavery and freedom and liberty, as those issues were being worked out both before and after the American Civil War, major events shaping our own history as Americans. They expressed their views on those in their private correspondence. Their views on national leaders and their politics. Thomas Kane himself personally knew and met with several United States presidents. There is in these correspondence reports of conversations he had with President Polk, Fillmore, Buchanan, and certainly Ulysses S. Grant, in addition to other members of presidential cabinets and other important public figures like Horace Greeley, who Kane provided an introduction to when Greeley came out to interview Brigham Young. Ulysses S. Grant, in fact, stayed in the Kane's home in 1869 while he was a sitting president of the United States. That's how intimate the Kane family was to some of these powerful people. Elizabeth actually wrote a detailed account of that visit, which we have in manuscript in our collection that I don't think has ever been used by a Ulysses S. Grant scholar yet. Their letters also contain a lot of information, particularly from Brigham Young's point of view, of evaluations of federally appointed officials sent to Utah, many of which, as you know, had some uneasy relationships with the Latter-day Saints. Brigham Young would invite in one of these letters Thomas L. Kane to serve as Utah's territorial delegate to Congress in 1854-55, just as Brigham Young's first term, or he really wasn't appointed to a second term, but nobody else was appointed to succeed him after his 4-year appointment as territorial governor. He wanted Kane to be the territorial representative. Kane, of course, ended up turning it down, but later tried to convince Ulysses S. Grant to appoint him as governor of Utah Territory, which didn't happen, of course. There's discussion of Indian relations. Both cared deeply about the treatment of American Indians in the American West, and their letters on occasion talk, particularly Brigham Young, talk about how he's relating to them, the problems, and so forth. There's information they share on both their families. There's a lot of consistent discussion of Utah's quest for statehood. Railroad development, both nationally and in Utah. How Mormons are being treated in the federal press. So literally we could give talks on every one of those topics. So it's a rich body of material that we have access to. There are special topics, of course. Kane himself, by the 1870s, was convinced he wanted to write Brigham Young's biography and began to collect material and eventually thought he might come to Utah to gather more information. And Brigham himself in some of these letters provided some biographical information about himself for that project. When the Kanes came out to meet with Brigham Young and traveled south to southern Utah and spent the winter of 1872-73 in St. George, they spent a lot of time talking. We can only know from indirect evidence all the things they talked about. We do know that they probably talked about Brigham Young's biography. We know that Kane advised Brigham Young to begin to prepare a will to protect himself and the church from all the issues that his future death might impose on the church and probate issues and so forth. And in fact, Kane would put Brigham Young in contact with a Philadelphia lawyer who would in fact draw up the first draft of Brigham's will, and that is in our Kane papers here at BYU. They would talk about education, arguing that as Kane was involved in education in Philadelphia, strongly encouraged Brigham Young to move to the next stage of the development of Mormon educational systems, including what became Brigham Young University. So we here at BYU benefit from counsel Kane gave to President Young in St. George. When he returned from that trip and was in Philadelphia and heard that Brigham was moving forward to establish an educational institution, this is what Kane wrote. Most cheering probably the most important feature of the tidings brought by Mr. George Buchanan is your resolve to found an educational institute worthy to bear your name. It is impossible to depreciate too seriously the growing practice of sending your bright youth abroad to lay the basis on the opinions of their lives on the crumbling foundations of modern unfaith and specialism. Why should you not inaugurate a system of education informed by your own experience of the world, embodying your own dearly earned wisdom and calculated peradventure to endure for ages with the stamp of your originality upon it? In fact, Kane's 4 December 1873, I think, is the earliest reference I've found of the name Brigham Young University. Now, of course, there was a number of institutions Brigham would found in the 1870s, and so it doesn't necessarily mean just this one, but the idea and eventually what I think became BYU is important in their discussions. Kane early suggested, I think, in these conversations that the Mormons move colonies into Arizona and subsequently into Mexico. They didn't do that while Brigham Young was alive, but his continuing influence with John Taylor had Mormon colony. Well, Brigham actually left St. George, came back to Utah, and began to call Mormons to go settle on the Colorado River and Little Colorado and so forth, and had thought about sending Mormon colonies into Mexico, but that would have to be delayed until the 1880s when, in fact, John Taylor, of course, began to do that. But the seeds for those were sown in the relationship that Thomas Kane shared with Brigham Young. There's always been a question, and we've skipped the rock across the pond. what did Cain believe? That's a source of a whole essay eventually. It's difficult to say. Even his own wife wasn't sure. She's sure he was a Christian, but wasn't sure just exactly what particular brand of Christianity he wanted to join. He did not join a church except the Presbyterians, which he allowed his children to be baptized in that, which Elizabeth was very active in. But most Mormons assumed that he had been secretly baptized by the Latter-day Saints. Why else would he be friends with us, right? I mean, he has to be a secret member. I mean, you wouldn't be friends with those crazy people out west unless you had been secretly baptized. Of course, that was not the case. We know that from a number of things. Here's a letter Brigham Young sent Thomas Cain discussing these very matters in May of 1858. My dear and tried friend, through our acquaintance from its commencement, which now dates from many years past, it has ever been marked by that frank interchange of views and feelings which should ever characterize the communications of those who have the welfare of mankind at heart, irrespective of sect or party. I am well assured by long and intimate acquaintance is a mutually signaled, shared by yourself in common with your best friends. Yet, so far as I can call, I do not remember to have ever, either in correspondence or in familiar conversation, except perhaps by a casual or unpursued remark, alluded to matters of religious faith. Now, this is over, 12 years after they met. Alluded to matters of religious belief, as entertained by myself and others who are commonly called Mormons. Nor do I remember that you have ever overstepped that most guarded reserve on this subject in all our communications, all your communications to me. So he says, the faith embraced by the Latter-day Saints is so naturally philosophical and so consistent with and enforcive of every valuable and true principle that should govern every department of life that I am strongly of the opinion that a plain, candid exposition of the faith of the everlasting gospel, which I have so much at heart, cannot probably fail at least to interest a person of your reflective turn of mind. Being such, and then he says, would it be possible for us to talk about religion? So he never joined. In about 10 years later, Brigham wrote him a letter, a paragraph of which says, you are doubtless aware, as heretofore, we should be much pleased to have you embrace the gospel we profess and are striving to obey. And no doubt but that you will do so in the spirit world, if you do not at this time. Well, let's cast the rock in now to Elizabeth, by the way, created some of the problems relating to whether or not Tom was baptized. She was not there, of course, but in a letter we have in our collections dated 1906, just a few years before her own death, she wrote a minister friend of hers, a Reverend Buckley, who was writing an account of his travels in the West, and he wanted to make sure he got her husband's relationship with the Mormons right. And so he sent her the chapter that he had written for his book. And he says, essentially, I understand that your husband was baptized by the Mormons when he met them in 1846. And Elizabeth wrote back an interesting letter. It is perfectly true that Colonel Cain was baptized. And I'm going to argue she didn't know what she was saying. But he was then believed to be dying. He was delirious and entirely unconscious of what they were about. We don't usually baptize delirious people, as far as I know in our history. They hollowed out a log and filled it with water from the Platte and put him in it. The shock aroused him and cooled the fever. Probably did him good physically, but I never heard any Mormon claim that it did him spiritual good on his own knowledge. I have no doubt that they deemed it efficacious to salvation, however, and did it from the purest of motives. Well, I think Elizabeth saying that probably helped create the image that, in fact, that he was baptized. But in fact, what's of course being described is not a baptism to join the church, but if anything, probably a health baptism, which we know began being practiced by Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo. Joseph Smith was baptized at least twice for Emma, or had, not for her, but baptized Emma for the restoration of health. It was a common practice that they carried into the Utah period, and I believe once the tabernacle was finished, the baptismal font there was set aside for one evening for a number of years for baptisms for restoration of health. So if anything, if they hollowed out a log and filled it full of water and then immersed him, that's some detail we didn't have until we have Elizabeth's letter. But there's no evidence anywhere in our, Brigham would have known had Tom been baptized in winter quarters, and of course, so would others who simply said he was not. But what drew Cain to the Mormons? We have a reminiscent account published later by Henry Boyle, who ended up walking with Thomas Cain after he came out west, where the Mormons were sort of scattered along the Missouri River in 1846. He arrived in June, and soon thereafter began visiting the Mormon camps. He hadn't met Brigham Young yet, by the way. The individual Boyle recalls their experience. During a walk through the woods one evening, following a narrow path through the thicket of undergrowth, we came suddenly within a few feet of a man who had just commenced to pray. As we wore on our feet Indian moccasins, we made no perceptible noise, and the man eventually thought himself alone and praying in secret. At the time, I was in the path just to the rear of the colonel, who, on hearing the beginning of the man's supplication, halted, and in so doing turned half around. In other words, they almost missed him when they heard him, and they turned, with his face in the bright light of the full moon, and in such a position that every feature was plain to my view. I never before listened to such a prayer, so contrite, so earnest, so fervent, and so full of inspiration. We had involuntarily taken our hats off, as though we were in a sacred presence. I can never forget my feelings on that occasion, neither can I describe them. And yet the colonel was more deeply affected than I was. As he stood there, I could see the tears falling from his face, and while his bosom swelled with the fullness of his emotions, and for some time after the man had arisen from his knees and walked away towards his encampment, the colonel sobbed like a child and could not trust himself to utter a word. When finally he got control of his feelings, his first words were, "I am satisfied. Your people are solemnly and terribly in earnest." So before he even met Brigham Young, he had a sense, I think, about what these Mormons were about. A few years later, Cain himself, in one of his letters to Brigham Young, recalled his experiences. He's writing this to Brigham Young in 11 July 1850. "I believe there is a crisis in the life of every man when he is called upon to decide seriously and permanently if he will die unto sin or live unto righteousness, and that, till he has gone through this, he cannot fit himself for the inheritance of his higher humanity, and become truly pure and strong to do the work of God, persevering unto the end, without endorsing the cart of preachers either. I believe that Providence brings about these crises for all of us by events in our lives which are the evangelist to us of preparation and admonition. Such an event, I believe, too, was my visit to you. I had had many disregarded hints and warnings before, but it was the spectacle of your noble self-denial and suffering for conscience' sake that first made a truly serious and abiding impression on my mind, commanding me to note that there was something higher and better than the pursuit of the interests of earthly life." Well, it was while there, of course, he took terribly ill, and the Latter-day Saints nursed him back to health, probably immersed him in water like they suggested, and there in September received his first of two patriarchal blessings. In part it read, this was given by Uncle John Smith, the church patriarch. "Inasmuch as thou hast had it in thy heart to promote the interest of the children of men, the Lord thy God is well pleased with thy exertions. He hath given his angels charge over thee, to guard thee in times of danger, to deliver thee out of all thy troubles, and defend thee from all thy enemies. Not a hair of thine head shall ever fall by the hand of an enemy. For thou art appointed to do a great work on the earth, and thou shalt be blessed in all thy undertakings, and thy name shall be had in honorable remembrance." We take that for our theme for our Cain exhibit and publication. Thy name shall be had in honorable remembrance among the saints to all generations. Thou shalt have a companion to comfort thy heart, to sustain thee under all thy trials. Thou shalt raise up sons and daughters that shall be esteemed as the excellent of the earth. Of course, at the time, Cain, and that's just an excerpt from it, Cain was pretty much unknown. He was single, and he'd let be known in his correspondence with his brothers and his parents that he had no intention of ever marrying. However, in April of 1853, when he was 31, he married his 16-year-old second cousin, Elizabeth Wood. They would, of course, have 2 sons and 3 daughters. In a letter to Brigham Young in February of 1851, he was still thinking about his blessing. He wrote, "Does that blessing still hold?" Brigham Young, in his response in September of 51, said, "I have talked to Patriarch John Smith, and he told me it still holds." Cain held a special place in his heart for the old patriarch, and Brigham Young reported to him several times the state of his health and his activities. In January of 1854, he wrote, "Your old friend, the patriarch, is slowly sinking away." Uncle John would die in May of 1854. On 10 July 1855, Cain wrote to President Young expressing his feelings of sadness on hearing of the death of John Smith, but announcing that he had just become the father of a new baby daughter. Just, he said, as Smith promised him that he would. Years later in St. George, visiting with St. George, what I mentioned, the local patriarch, William G. Perkins, pronounced another blessing on the head of Tom, and this time Elizabeth as well. In their blessings, this local patriarch sealed them up to eternal life. Fairly unusual, I think, for non-Mormons to have that in the 19th century. At the same time that Elizabeth received her own blessing with the same promise, but she, as always, remained skeptical about Mormonism. She recorded in her journal at the time her thoughts about the blessing. Quote, "The blessing was somewhat prophetical, so far as it did not coincide with the one given Cain, her husband, long ago by the old patriarch John Smith, which has been curiously fulfilled so far, strange to say." It was always that sense that something was going on. Well, Cain, of course, while at winter quarters, assisted the Mormons in getting permission to stay on the Omaha lands, helped convince Mormon leaders that they could trust President Polk's invitation for them to stay on the lands. All of that, including the documents the chiefs put their X on, allowing the Mormons to stay there, statements Cain gathered on the Mormons' good character, all of those are in our collection here at BYU. He, in fact, assisted Captain James Allen, the man sent to recruit what became the Mormon Battalion. He actually stayed in Captain Allen's tent. We actually have a drawing Cain made of the tent in our collection. But here, I think, was the beginning of what would become a familiar pattern in Mormon history. Cain would play the role of the middleman, softening perceptions, diffusing tense situations, and helping the Mormons defend themselves in this growing national audience. Cain, of course, himself throughout his life would return to those critical events of 1846. By defending the Mormons, he said in a letter to Brigham Young in July of 1850, "As it happened that the personal assaults upon myself make your cause become so identified with my own, that your vindication became my own defense." Well, I won't read all of that. Further, he said he had altered his will. Requesting on his death, he told Brigham Young, to receive my heart to be deposited in the temple of your Salt Lake City, that after death it may repose, where in metaphor at least where it often was when living. Now, there's a man who was sincere and remained that way throughout his life. I think you can see why Brigham Young loved him. Well, we just have time for a couple of things. Mormons accused, non-Mormon critics accused the Mormons of hiding plural marriage from Cain. That is not true. At least initially, they didn't feel the need to tell him about it, of course. But when Cain was helping Jedediah Grant, Brigham Young's counselor and the mayor of Salt Lake City, write responses to the first set of runaway federal officials in 1852, they were sitting together going through the charges that appeared in the newspapers. And when they came to the charge the Mormons practiced plural marriage, Cain remarked to him, "Well, we don't have to deal with that. We know that's obviously untrue." And in a letter that Grant wrote back to Cain, wrote back to Brigham Young, he says, "Well, didn't want to leave our friend exposed, so I felt the need to tell him just how much it was true. Cain wrote to Young, I want to thank you for making my old friend Grant the bearer to me of his tidings. But I ought not to conceal from you that they gave me great pain. Independent of every other consideration, my pride in you depends so much on your holding your position in the van of human progress that I have to grieve over your favor to a custom which belongs essentially, I think, to communities in other respects behind your own. I think it my duty to give you thus distinctly my counsel that you err. I can now discharge yourself and myself from further notice of the subject. What would a friend do, you see, with that kind of knowledge? He defended him for 10 years. Brigham writes back, permit me to thank you most cordially for your open, frank, and candid expression of your views and feelings on one important truth connected with my history and the history of my friends and worlds with which I associate. Your brief, explicit, plain expression of fear and feeling endears you more to me than all the rhetoric of the ages could have done. Permit me to say your plainness strengthens our bonds of endearments, for my soul delights in plainness. The truth between them strengthened their friendship. It didn't pull them apart. When Jeremiah Black, the U.S. Attorney General, after Brigham Young was replaced as governor, wanted to know more details about what Brigham Young knew about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Cain again wrote Young and said, we need a statement. On the 15th of December, 1859, and the original letter is in our Cain collection, Brigham wrote in part, neither yourself nor anyone acquainted with me, and he didn't talk much about this in public, so he's really writing tender things to his friend, neither you nor anyone acquainted with me will require my assurance that had I been apprised of the intended onslaught at the Meadows, I should have used such effort for its prevention as the time, distance, and my influence and faculties would have permitted. The horrifying event transpired without my knowledge, except from after report, and the recurring thought of it ever causes a shudder in my feelings. It is a subject exclusively within the province of judicial proceedings, and I have known and still prefer to know nothing touching the affair until I, in common with other people, learn the facts as they may have developed before those whose right it is to investigate and adjudicate their own. He did, of course, get reports from George A. Smith and others. Colonel, you may think this is a singular statement, but the facts of the massacre of men, women, and children are so shocking and crucifying to my feelings that I have not suffered myself to hear any more about them than the circumstances of conversation would compel. I think that's not the comments of a bloodthirsty man, as our enemies often suggest. Well, finally, of course, the great Cain visit to the Mormons in southern Utah with Brigham Young in 1872-73. Let me just conclude with a couple of comments. I think it was that experience that allowed Elizabeth to get to know Brigham Young like her husband knew him. And she started out not liking him. Her journals for the period clearly reveal that. Some of the letters she sent her father were later gathered into a book, To Our Mormon Homes, and Ed Gary, who's with us today, is going to elaborate on that later in our lecture series, just their relationship and all of that, and so I don't go into that in too much detail. But she has a couple of things in her journal in which she says when she was in St. George, Tom took ill again, and they were worried about his survival. And she'd gone out for a walk, and she comes back, according to a journal, and came into her husband's room, and there her husband was asleep in the bed, and there Brigham Young was kneeling at his side praying for his old friend. I think she was as deeply moved as I think I would have been in that experience. And then she wrote in her journal, my goodness, I should go back and tone down all the bad things I've said about Brigham Young. Well, she came away liking Mormon women better, not agreeing with polygamy, but liking them better and liking the Latter-day Saints better. I think she came by that period to see what Tom Cain saw early on. Well, what does all this mean for those of us who live many years later? Well, I think we are invited by using the Cain collection, and it's a rich collection. There's enough there for theses and dissertations and articles on all kinds of topics. I would suggest that we well, one of the things we will try to do in our exhibit that will open next month is to display some of the things I've mentioned today, but a lot of other things we haven't had a chance to talk about. Things will be related to talks that scholars we've invited to talk, as indicated on your little flyer there, to expand and deepen our understanding of Thomas Paine. I think that blessing given to him in 1846, that he would be held in honorable remembrance, is something we continue to try to fulfill, I think. At least I've felt that through the years. When Cain was dying, he said that he wanted to send a sweet message to his Mormon friends. My dear Mormon friends, as Elizabeth wrote to George Buchanan after announcing to the Mormons that he had passed away. Well, so much more we could say, and we'll leave that to other times. I would invite you to for the lectures that we're going to have in the coming months. We invite you next month to come for the opening of the exhibit, where we'll have some wonderful things, photographs as well as paintings, as well as letters and other things. And I hope that you will come to share the richness of this man's life and his great contributions to our history, as I've come to know. Thank you.